Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine. Focus question. How was Saint Augustine settled and what is its history? Settling Saint Augustine. The city of Saint Augustine sits in the sunny east coast of Florida. It is the oldest continuously lived-in settlement of European and African origin in the United States. Pedro Menendez de Aviles founded Saint Augustine in September of 1565, 42 years before the English founded Jamestown in 1607. Menendez named the city after the Catholic Saint Augustine, who was the patron saint of his hometown in Spain. 2 months earlier, Menendez had left Spain with a group of soldiers, sailors, and enslaved and free African people, including women and children. 600 of them made it to the shores of Florida. The settlement of Saint Augustine struggled to provide food for themselves. The Timucua people, a local indigenous tribe, gave food and help to the colonists. Some of the Spain men married Timucua women. Saint Augustine grew into a busy town. Its residents soon included Spain colonists, indigenous people, mostly women who had married colonists and become Catholic, African people, both free and enslaved, and Germans. The relationship between settlers and Timucua people began to friendly terms, but soon broke down. The Spanish brought diseases that killed many indigenous people, sometimes entire tribes. The Timucua people began to attack the Spanish settlement to force them away. The city can conflicts with other European settlers as well. Pedro Menendez was sent by Spain to force out French colonists who had settled in the area a year earlier, in 1564. Their settlement, Fort Caroline, was up the coast from Saint Augustine near present-day Jacksonville. But like other European countries, Spain wanted Florida for its own. Since Spain was a Catholic country, Menendez spared the French Catholics there, but scared the French Protestants. The Timucua people. The Timucua people lived in current-day Georgia and northern Florida. When European settlers arrived in the 1500s, there were around 20,000 Timucua people living on the land. 200,000 Timucua people living on the land. However, European forces and disease killed many Timucua people. By 1800, there were no Timucua left. Scholars study artifacts left by Timucuan people to learn more about them, since there are none left to tell their own stories. Drake's attack. Sir Francis Drake was an English sailor, colonizer, and trader of enslaved people. In 1585, Queen Elizabeth sent him to attack Spanish forces in Saint Augustine. Conflicts were rising between Protestant England and Catholic Spain. The nephew of Pedro Menendez was now the Spanish governor of Saint Augustine. He had been warned that Drake was off the coast of Florida with 23 ships and 2,000 men. The Spanish governor had fewer than 100 soldiers, so he ordered the residents out of the city. When Drake and his soldiers arrived in Saint Augustine, it was empty. Many residents of the town were hiding in the woods nearby. Menendez led a small skirmish between his forces and the British. Still, Drake took over Saint Augustine. At that time, the buildings were mostly made of wood and clay. This made them easy to burn down. Drake burned buildings in surrounding area and took anything of value. He didn't burn down a nearby Timucua village. However, he wanted the indigenous people to be united with the British in later conflicts. After the town was looted and burned, Drake and his men left. The Spanish returned to rebuild, mostly with wooden thatch. In March of 1599, another fire burned through the town. That September, a hurricane caused severe food damage. The future of Saint Augustine was not looking bright. Changing hands. In 1602, Spain tried to decide the fate of Saint Augustine. Should Spain keep it, move it, abandon it? The King of Spanish decided to keep where it was. In time, Spanish leaders gave money to build Castillo de San Marcos, and building began in 1672. This stone fort would help the city's defense. Still, for much of the 1600s, Saint Augustine continued to be poor, isolated, and ignored by the Spanish crown, which was fighting various wars in Europe. The shipwrecks sometimes stopped aid and supplies from reaching the town. Indigenous uprisings, severe damage, and pirate attacks took their toll on the town and its people. Lastly, the English posed a growing threat. The Spanish controlled Florida, but the British controlled colonies to the north. Spain wanted to make things difficult for Britain, so they created a safe place for certain enslaved people. When escapees made it to Saint Augustine, the Spanish governor let them stay as free people if they promised to be loyal to Spain. In 1738, the governor founded a community called the Most North of Saint Augustine for certain enslaved and free black people. British attacks against Saint Augustine continued. Spain joined the 7 Years' War in Europe in 1763 on the side of France against England. When that war ended, the Treaty of Paris gave England Florida in exchange for Cuba, and many Spanish residents left Florida and moved there. The British ruled Florida until 1783, when the Second Treaty of Paris was signed and England recognized the United States as a country. The United States gained control of Florida in 1819 and it became a state in 1845. 17 years later, it joined the Civil War on the Confederate side. Lincolnville. During the Civil War, many black Indian soldiers came from the Moose community. Some settled in St. Augustine after the war. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, it freed thousands of enslaved people of Confederate states. On January 1st, 1863, more than 670 enslaved people gathered in the vacant lot, later named Liberation Lot. These liberated people founded a neighborhood of Lincolnville named after the president. By the 1880s, many black residents were property owners who had built their own homes, businesses, and churches. Many served in public office until the turn of the century, but restrictive voting laws and other policies took rights away from black citizens. In 1991, the Lincolnville Historic District was added to the National Register of Historic Places to honor the importance of his historically black neighborhood. 20 years after the Civil War ended, a man named Harry Fletcher worked to turn St. Augustine into a vacation site for wealthy Americans. Fletcher built many hotels in the city. His railroad company connected St. Augustine to cities in the East Coast. This brought opportunity and political activity. From 1963 to 1964, the city was the site of the St. Augustine movement. Many people were arrested as they protested segregation. In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spent time there in an effort to pass the Civil Rights Act. St. Augustine today. St. Augustine celebrated its 450th birthday in 2015. The celebration gave residents and visitors a chance to celebrate the rich history of St. Augustine with parties all year long. Architecture in St. Augustine. St. Augustine has a straight pattern and a tree architecture that reflects in Spanish organ. The first 1800s brought ornate architecture, and many buildings were specially designed and constructed. This building added to the charm of the city, which in return attract more visitors. Today, however, the Atlantic Ocean regularly floods the city, threatening the historic buildings. These floods are becoming worse and more frequent as sea levels rise. The many cultural influences of the city can be seen in its buildings, foods, and people. Today, St. Augustine is a popular place to vacation. Tourists can walk through sites like Castillo de San Marcos or visit museums. They can spend time on the beach and admire the city's beautiful buildings. Wherever you go, St. Augustine is filled with history.